Why does the place that claims to hold the keys to heaven guard so many doors on earth? If truth is sacred, why are its oldest records sealed behind walls no one is allowed to breach? Why is it that an institution built on Scripture has locked away more knowledge than it has shared? From the outside, the Vatican is a symbol of openness, welcoming millions every year through St. Peter's Basilica, speaking to billions through papal messages, appearing in every major history book as a pillar of continuity. Yet behind this holy transparency lies the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the most impenetrable vault of documents in the modern world. A vault that does not deny its existence, yet offers no answers to the most basic question: what is inside? The paradox is staggering. An institution meant to illuminate the soul has constructed the deepest shadows on earth. And perhaps that is no accident. Let's rewind. In every civilization, the greatest temples were also the greatest libraries. Knowledge was once sacred, not separate from belief, but its foundation. The priest was the scholar, the scribe a mystic. In Egypt, in Babylon, in India, the divine and the intellectual walked hand in hand, but in medieval Europe, that link was broken. Or rather, it was monopolized. After the fall of Rome, something curious happened. Knowledge didn't simply vanish, it was absorbed, collected, sequestered. While much of Europe descended into what we now call the Dark Ages, the Church did not fade, it grew stronger. But it didn't grow through war or conquest, it grew through control of the past. Books were not destroyed, not always. That would be too obvious. Instead, they were preserved, but restricted. The Vatican positioned itself not just as the voice of God, but the editor of memory, the keepers of light, yes, but only a light you were permitted to see. And here lies the core of the contradiction. If truth is eternal and divine, why must it be hidden? Because truth, unchecked, is dangerous. Throughout history, those who control belief often find it is not enough. They must also control what came before belief. The origin stories, the ancient scrolls, the inconvenient manuscripts. For if people discovered that others before them had already dreamed, discovered, written, and questioned what the Church claimed as its own, the authority of the Church would fracture. That is why the Vatican, unique among all powers, built its empire not just in stone, but in silence. Consider this: the Vatican has its own postal service, its own currency, its own time zone, and its own diplomatic corps. But more than any nation on earth, it also has its own timeline. The calendar most of the world uses today, the Gregorian, was developed and imposed by papal decree. That means the measurement of time itself was recalibrated, not by scientists but by clergy. And who gave them the data to make that change? Who verified the centuries-old astronomical records they used to correct the Julian calendar? No one outside the Church ever saw them. We call it a reform, but what if it was a rewrite? The deeper you dig into Vatican history, the more you find a theme not of suppression by force, but curation by omission. The true power of the Vatican lies not in what it says, but in what it refuses to say, not in what it reveals, but in what it quietly withholds behind doors labeled private, classified, for the faithful only. It doesn't need to burn books, it only needs to store them where no one can read. And yet the most unsettling part is this: the Vatican does not deny any of it. The secret archives are real. The forbidden books list existed for 400 years. The vaults are protected by Swiss guards, layers of bureaucracy, and codes of access that only the highest scholars with Vatican favor can obtain. Some researchers wait decades to see a single document. Some are never granted access at all. The world accepts this as normal. But imagine if another power, say a government, a corporation, a monarchy, held over 50 kilometers of shelving filled with documents going back over 1,000 years, and refused to disclose what was inside. Would we not call it a scandal, a cover-up, a theft of memory? Yet when the Vatican does it, we call it tradition. And so we must ask, what kind of light is this that casts such long shadows? This is not an accusation, it is an invitation to re-examine what we think we know. an invitation to question the most fundamental assumption of all, that those who claim to lead us toward truth have no reason to hide it. Because if truth is divine, why must it be so carefully protected from view? And if history is the story of humanity's journey, what happens when the map has been redrawn by hands we were never allowed to see? In the pages to follow, we will open doors that were never meant to be opened. We will ask questions that echo across centuries. We will examine not just what was lost, but what was deliberately kept. Because perhaps the Vatican is not merely the custodian of spiritual light. Perhaps it is the last institution guarding a deeper secret, that the light we trust may have been filtering out more than darkness. Tucked behind the frescoes and fountains of the Apostolic Palace lies a hallway few ever see. No pilgrims walk its length, no cameras flash, and beyond that corridor, guarded by Swiss soldiers and bureaucratic layers more intricate than any labyrinth, begins the most enigmatic library on earth, the Vatican Secret Archive. It is real, not rumor, not legend, not coded metaphor from some ancient Dan Brown thriller. It exists, and it has existed, uninterrupted, for centuries. Yet despite its name, the archive is not truly secret, at least not in the way the word suggests today. The Latin term secretum originally meant private or personal, but in practice privacy is the perfect mask for secrecy, and the line between the two blurs when access is controlled so tightly that even the world's most accomplished historians must beg for entry. You cannot browse the archive. You cannot walk its aisles freely. You cannot photograph, copy, or even touch many of its materials unless you've been approved at multiple levels, and even then, only a select handful of documents are made available to you. You are told what you may read. You are told how long you may read it. You are told what it means before you can ever decide for yourself. So let us ask the obvious. What could possibly be inside that requires such devotion to control? The Vatican claims it houses over 1 million documents spanning more than 12 centuries, stored in over 50 kilometers of shelving, buried beneath and behind the Vatican walls. The oldest letter in the collection is said to be from the 8th century. The most controversial, unknown. Because despite the archive being open to qualified scholars since 1880, that's not a library. That's a fortress. And the truth is, no one, not even popes, has explored the entire archive. The layout remains unpublicized. The documents are organized by a private classification system unknown to any external institution. If the Library of Alexandria had survived intact, but buried under papal stone, it would look like this. But perhaps that's not just a comparison. Perhaps it's closer to the truth than we've ever dared consider. According to scattered reports, travelers' accounts, and whispers from the few scholars who have entered and emerged, the Vatican archive may contain not only letters and papal bulls, but entire histories lost to the rest of the world. Some even claim that documents held within reference events, names and technologies that do not exist anywhere else in recorded history. No scans, no searchable database, no official catalog accessible to the public. It is knowledge placed behind a door with no handle on the outside. Why? Some say it's for preservation, others for religious protection. But one cannot preserve knowledge by suffocating it, and no religion worthy of the truth should fear what its own documents might reveal. So again we ask, what are they hiding? Among the most often speculated contents, original versions of biblical texts that diverge from modern canon, the full Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned books, with annotations on why they were banned, unpublished records of the Inquisition, detailing trials, tortures, and political eliminations masked as heresy, ancient pre-Christian scrolls, confiscated during the Church's earliest expansions, letters between popes and emperors, kings and crusaders, which could rewrite the alliances of European history. But there's one category whispered of more than any other: maps. Detailed, ancient, impossible maps, charts that depict geographies unexplored until centuries after they were supposedly drawn. Descriptions of islands, coastlines, even continents that do not align with the official history of exploration. And if these maps are real, then they raise an even more chilling question. Did someone already know about the world long before we were taught it was discovered? In a normal library, such documents would be celebrated, published, studied. Here they are sealed, unseen, untouchable. And this raises the most uncomfortable question of all. Is the Vatican archive hiding information to protect belief or to protect power? Because belief, in its truest form, needs no gatekeeper. But power thrives behind locked doors. You might argue, perhaps it's better this way. Perhaps the world is not ready. Perhaps the knowledge inside could collapse faith, destroy social harmony, unleash chaos. But if truth is that fragile, is it truth at all? And if those in power believe humanity is not ready to see its past, who gave them the authority to decide when we are? The irony is painful. A church built on the concept of revelation has become the most secretive institution on earth. And behind its walls, behind its tapestries and ancient oak doors, may lie not only the missing chapters of human history, but the tools to reshape them. And if those tools fall only into the hands of a few, how long until history itself is not something we inherit, but something we are assigned? This is why the archive matters. Not because it's mysterious, but because it's controlled. And in an age where every person carries a camera, a GPS, a digital encyclopedia in their pocket, there remains one place where you may not look, you may not ask, and you may not know. Perhaps someday the door will open. But until then, the Vatican archive stands not as a vault of paper, but a vault of silence. A silence so complete, it becomes indistinguishable from erasure. Books are more than bound paper and ink. They are memory incarnate, a way for civilizations to speak across centuries, for ideas to echo beyond the voice, for truth to outlive its tellers. And yet some books don't just fade, they vanish. Not from neglect, but by design. The Vatican calls them apocrypha, texts written alongside the Bible but excluded from its official form. Others call them heresy, dangerous, false. Yet in their pages lies a version of history we were never meant to see. Have you ever wondered who decides what qualifies as truth in print? Who determines which gospels belong in Scripture and which are exiled to the footnotes of forgotten history? When Christianity began to rise, there were dozens of competing interpretations. The early followers of Jesus wrote gospels, visions, letters, and teachings, not one, but many. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Peter, each told a slightly different story, not of a distant Christ, but of a human teacher, a mystic rebel, a guide who urged people to seek the truth within themselves, not through temples or priests. And that was the problem. Because a personal spirituality could not be controlled. A man who found God on his own would not kneel at the altar, and so one by one these books were labeled non-canonical, pushed to the margins, and eventually banned outright. You might think, they're just old writings, what does it matter now? But imagine a Bible where Jesus does not speak of churches or priests, where Mary Magdalene is portrayed not as a sinner, but as the closest disciple, where salvation is not a transaction, but a reawakening of knowledge long buried in the soul. Imagine a version of Christianity built not on obedience but on inner awareness. Would the Vatican still hold its authority? The loss of these books wasn't a passive forgetting, it was an orchestrated purge. In 1559, the Church formalized its control over ideas with a document both chilling and bureaucratic, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Over 400 years, this growing list banned entire categories of thought, scientific treatises, philosophical texts, historical documents, even translations of the Bible into local languages. Anything that challenged church authority or dared offer a parallel narrative was stamped as forbidden. Writers were excommunicated, printers executed. Possession of the wrong book could lead to prison or the stake. But the most disturbing part, many of the books were never destroyed. They were confiscated, taken not to bonfires but to shelves deep within Vatican vaults. Like prisoners held in solitary confinement, they still exist, preserved in darkness. Even today, after the index was officially abolished in 1966, those texts remain largely unreleased. They are not forgotten, they are guarded. And when questioned, the Church offers only a familiar response to protect the faithful from confusion. But faith without questions is not belief, it is submission. So what lies in those lost pages? The Book of Enoch describes angelic beings descending to earth, teaching early humans astronomy, metallurgy, and secrets of the heavens. The Gospel of Judas paints Judas not as a traitor, but as the only disciple who understood Jesus' true mission. The Gospel of Mary suggests she was entrusted with teachings that even Peter did not comprehend, and that early Christian leadership may not have been exclusively male. If these ideas had remained part of the mainstream tradition, the history of the Western world might have unfolded very differently. But instead, they were erased from the collective memory, not because they were false, but because they were too true for the structure the Church intended to build. And that raises a deeper question. How much of Western spirituality, law, and culture is built not on divine inspiration but on editorial decisions made behind closed doors? Scholars who attempt to resurrect these texts often face more than academic resistance. They're branded controversial, their funding pulled, their findings buried under a flood of institutional counterarguments. Even when translations are released, they're labeled as Gnostic or mythological, diminishing their place in the public consciousness. It's not censorship in the modern sense, it's curated invisibility. And here's the paradox. The Vatican holds the largest private collection of these forbidden texts, yet also declares them irrelevant. Why not open them all? Why not digitize and publish every manuscript so the world can decide? Because knowledge, once released, cannot be recontained, and the Vatican understands that better than anyone. The power of a story isn't just in telling it, it's in keeping all other stories silent. Today, if you search online, you'll find fragments of these apocryphal books. You might even hold a printed copy of the Gospel of Thomas in your hands. But what you won't find are the complete original versions, untouched, untranslated, unredacted, the ones held in the deepest vaults, the ones that might not only retell Christianity, but redefine human history. And if we are forbidden to read our own past in full, what else have we been forbidden to remember? The past is not lost, it was hidden. The truth is not gone, it is sealed. And the most dangerous knowledge is not the one that contradicts faith, but the one that reveals how faith was shaped. In the next chapter, we'll follow this trail of omission to an even stranger destination, the moment when the Church stopped just editing knowledge and began reshaping time itself. Because to truly control the story, you don't just write the ending. You rewrite the beginning. We live by numbers. We wake to clocks, schedule our lives by calendars, celebrate anniversaries, record history in precise years, 1476, 1492, 1776, 2025. We believe time is fixed, linear, objective, a river flowing forward, unbroken. But what if the river was rerouted? What if time, like Scripture, was edited? And what if the editors sat not in observatories or universities, but in Vatican chambers? The Gregorian calendar you follow today, whether you live in Rome, Tokyo, or San Francisco, originated in a papal decree. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII replaced the Julian calendar, claiming it had drifted out of alignment with the solar year. His reform corrected the date of Easter by removing 10 days from the calendar. Overnight, October 4th became October 15th. We're told this was a scientific adjustment, but how do you verify time when all historical records are filtered through the same institution that edited it? More unsettling still, how did the Vatican know exactly how many days had gone missing when the drift had accumulated over 13 centuries? They claimed the sun no longer rose on the correct date of the spring equinox. But the tools to make that measurement with precision, atomic clocks, satellite readings, didn't exist. What did exist was something far more powerful: faith in papal authority. When the Pope declared a new calendar, the world eventually obeyed. But calendars are not clocks. They are frameworks of history. Change the calendar, and you change the way people understand the past. And here lies the deeper truth. The Gregorian reform wasn't just about celestial alignment. It was about narrative alignment. Consider this. By realigning the calendar, the Vatican gained the power to decide when certain historical events happened, when kings reigned, when saints were canonized, when heresies were extinguished, when empires rose and fell. Now ask, what if certain events never happened at all, but were inserted to fill gaps? What if others were moved to fabricate a sense of divine timing? Enter the phantom time hypothesis, a theory so controversial it's often dismissed before it's even read. It suggests that nearly 300 years of European history, from roughly 6114 to 911, were fabricated, inserted by medieval chroniclers and later reinforced by the Vatican's calendar reform to extend the Church's historical timeline and divine succession. Absurd? Maybe. But then consider this. No substantial archaeological evidence exists for many of the people and events supposedly occurring in that span. Astronomical records, eclipses, planetary alignments don't align with the Gregorian chronology. Duplicate kings and emperors appear across centuries with different names but nearly identical biographies. The year we call 2025 may actually be 1725, with centuries of invented time between. If that sounds impossible, ask yourself this: who had the motive, the means, and the control to alter time itself? Only the Vatican. By inserting centuries into the calendar, they could extend the perceived antiquity of the Church, making it appear older than rival institutions. Position key events, such as the reigns of emperors or the fulfillment of prophecies, exactly where needed in the divine timeline. Legitimize power by tying it to ancient authority that may never have existed. And if you're skeptical, good, you should be. But remember, skepticism requires access to evidence, and where is that evidence kept? The Vatican Secret Archive. Scholars who have attempted to challenge the official timeline are often met with silence, or worse, exclusion from academic journals, loss of funding, accusations of fringe conspiracy. But beneath their questions lies a simple idea. Time is a story, and stories can be edited. Just as early Christian councils decided which books made it into the Bible, so too could later institutions decide which years made it into history. And there's something more troubling still. If a religion wishes to declare its authority as a continuation of prophecy, then the timeline must match. If a pope wants to claim divine succession from Peter himself, then there can be no gaps. If a church wishes to be the fulfillment of destiny, then history must be rewritten to fit. The calendar then is not a neutral measure of days. It is a doctrinal instrument. It tells the faithful when to remember, when to mourn, when to rejoice, when Christ was born, when Rome fell, when time itself began. And all of it, every hour, every year, is filtered through a framework defined by one institution that answers to no other. What happens when a society loses track of true time? It loses its reference points, its ability to verify. It becomes dependent on those who define the calendar for them. And the Vatican, by anchoring its power not just in the heavens, but in the ticking of the clock, made itself more than a church. It made itself the keeper of time. So when you look at your calendar today, when you schedule a meeting, a birthday, a holiday, remember that neat little box labeled 2025 didn't just arrive from the stars. It was given to you. The Vatican restructured time in the name of salvation, but whether they saved time or rewrote it to serve their story is a question few dare ask. Because once you question the calendar, everything unravels. Your age, your history, your past, your future. And in the chapters to come, we will follow that unraveling even deeper into a stretch of centuries where almost nothing seems to have happened. But perhaps that's not because time stood still. Perhaps it was fabricated altogether. What if there was a period in history that never happened? It's a question that sounds like science fiction or the premise of an academic hoax, yet it's one that refuses to go away. Historians, astronomers, and independent researchers have begun to whisper the same term once more. The phantom time hypothesis. According to this theory, nearly 300 years of medieval European history between roughly 6114 and 911 CE were invented, inserted, fabricated. The kings, the popes, the battles, even the architecture, fictional or duplicated from earlier eras. It is, in short, the ghost chapter of time. And here's the unsettling part. Once you look closely, the evidence doesn't vanish. It grows. You would expect, during 3 centuries, a wealth of artifacts, writings, civic records, tombs, buildings, laws, scientific progress. But instead, the historical record of this period is eerily thin, names without faces, events without context, dates that don't align. The deeper you dig into the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, the more the fog thickens. Consider this. Charlemagne, one of the most celebrated figures of early medieval Europe, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, hero of countless legends, bears an uncanny resemblance to Constantine the Great, who lived 4 centuries earlier. Both were military geniuses. Both enacted sweeping Christian reforms. Both centralized fragmented empires. Both left suspiciously little verifiable physical evidence behind. Are we seeing 2 men, or one man's story repeated under a different name? Across medieval chronicles, the overlap is hard to ignore. Kings and bishops in different regions bear similar names, enact similar laws, die in similar ways. Cathedrals built centuries apart feature the same design language down to the blueprints. Entire royal lineages emerge and disappear in strange symmetry, as if fulfilling a predetermined script rather than living through history. And when asked to explain these anomalies, official historians reply, the records were lost. But loss on this scale across continents and cultures is not a coincidence. It's a pattern. Now imagine the implications. If this theory holds, then our current year isn't 2025, it's more like 1725. That's not just a misprint. That is a chronological deception of cosmic scale. Why would anyone do this? And who would have had the power to do so? 3 names appear in every investigation. Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor. Gerbert of Aurillac, a scholar who later became Pope Sylvester II, and the institution that united them, the Vatican. Around the turn of the first millennium, Otto III had a problem. He was young, ambitious, and eager to position his rule as part of a divine historical continuum. But the timing wasn't right. Prophecy said the year 1000 would mark a great spiritual awakening. The Messiah would return, the Church would be elevated, a new holy empire would emerge. But the calendar was off. He was too early. Unless time could be adjusted. If several centuries were retroactively inserted into the historical record, then Otto's reign would fall precisely at the prophetic moment. The empire would appear ordained. The Church, the fulfillment of destiny. What was once ambition would now look like divine alignment. And all it would take was one thing: control over the recording of time. Who kept the official dates? Who preserved the historical documents? Who copied the chronicles, updated the church registers, canonized the saints, reprinted the Bibles? The Church. More specifically, monks working in scriptoria across Europe, most under direct or indirect control of the Vatican. They alone had the authority and tools to retroactively correct the timeline, to adjust reigns, deaths, wars, and coronations, to backfill history with names and stories, to bury contradictions. And here's where it gets darker. The centuries in question, those 297 phantom years, also just happened to be the weakest in archaeological evidence across Europe. Very few coins, very few inscriptions, very few original manuscripts dated to that time. Most of what we know comes from copies written much later, often within Vatican walls. Why does this matter? Because if this period is fictional, then everything built upon it is compromised. The unbroken line of papal succession, fabricated. The rise of Christian Europe, staged. The dating of sacred relics, the legitimacy of saints, the timing of canon law, all now in question. Even astronomical records don't align. Modern software can predict solar eclipses backward thousands of years. When astronomers try to cross-reference medieval eclipse accounts with actual celestial data, the discrepancies are alarming. Some events appear to have happened under clear skies. Others that should be visible aren't mentioned at all. The stars do not lie, but our records of them might. So what did the Vatican gain? A narrative, one of continuity, prophecy, and sacred legacy. A divine calendar where the Church never lost control. A timeline that placed them at the center of both past and future. And in the silence of that fabricated time, no one could argue. No rival empire could contradict them. No scholar could verify, because the evidence had not been lost. It had been written after the fact. Today, most mainstream historians reject the phantom time hypothesis. They call it absurd, fringe, a distraction, but they never fully disprove it. They offer probabilities, assumptions, and trust in continuity, but not hard refutations. Because to do so, they would need access to the original records. And where are those stored? In the Vatican archive. A vault with documents no one can examine, shelves no one may browse, manuscripts that may be the keys to unraveling not only the timeline but the entire scaffolding of Western historical consciousness. When time becomes a script, who holds the pen? The Vatican doesn't need to confirm or deny the phantom time. It only needs to remain silent. That silence becomes its strongest defense and its most potent weapon. And perhaps that's the true genius of inventing centuries. You don't just reshape history. You bury the truth in a grave so deep, no one even knows to dig. We are taught to see the past as blind. Ancient people, we're told, knew little of the world beyond their borders. They believed Earth was flat, that oceans dropped into nothingness, and that beyond the known world, monsters lurked. The great voyages of discovery, the 15th and 16th centuries were, we are told, the moment humanity opened its eyes. But what if the eyes had already been open and then deliberately closed? There are maps that shouldn't exist. Maps drawn before the age of exploration, but which depict coastlines, continents and islands no European should have known existed. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, it shows the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, and astonishingly, the northern edge of Antarctica without ice. Let that sink in. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and its ice-free coastline has been hidden beneath glaciers for thousands of years, yet the Piri Reis map shows it in shocking accuracy. How? Admiral Piri Reis claimed he compiled his map from ancient source charts, including Greek, Arabic, and very old sea maps. He said some came from Alexandria, the city whose legendary library burned, or perhaps was harvested. Where did those source maps come from? Who drew them? And more importantly, where did they go? Because if those maps existed, they must have been stored, preserved, copied. And today, only one institution on Earth is known to possess a massive cache of ancient, unpublished cartographic records. The Vatican. In a sealed section of the Vatican Apostolic Archive lies a treasure few have seen, a map collection so extensive it would take decades to catalog if you were ever allowed to try. Fewer than 1% of these maps have been made public. The rest remain in darkness, and according to those few scholars granted even partial access, some of these maps contradict the entire narrative of European geographic ignorance. There are charts of South American river systems long before they were discovered. Maps showing the polar regions with geographic features no explorer could have recorded at the time. Islands that no longer exist or were never supposed to. Journeys plotted in Arabic, Coptic, and pre-Latin languages, suggesting pre-Christian global navigation. Mainstream historians scoff. They call them anomalies, misstated, misinterpreted. But anomalies, when they multiply, become a pattern. And the pattern here is clear. Knowledge once existed and was erased. The question is not whether these maps were real. The question is, who collected them and why were they hidden? The Church has long had a complex relationship with geography. On one hand, it sent missionaries across the globe. On the other, it worked hard to define a theological geography. Jerusalem as the center, the Holy Land as divine focus, all else peripheral or pagan. Any knowledge that contradicted this worldview, like maps suggesting non-Christian civilizations with advanced navigation, was a threat. And so such knowledge wasn't destroyed. That would draw attention. It was absorbed, restricted, moved to where only those with clearance could see it, where it could be interpreted, or conveniently left unmentioned. Because maps are more than just representations of the earth. They are expressions of power. He who controls the map controls where people believe they are, and more importantly, where they believe they came from. When a map shows a continent long before it was discovered, it raises a dangerous question: who was there first? If Antarctica was once charted ice-free, then who explored it, thousands of years before modern civilization had the tools? If a map contradicts official history, then it does not just challenge knowledge, it challenges the authority that sanctioned that history. This is why the Vatican has been so cautious with its maps. To release them is to open a Pandora's box. To acknowledge their implications is to risk rewriting the entire narrative of human exploration. Because if the Church has known about the true geography of the world for centuries, if it possessed data long before it was rediscovered, then what else does it know? And more importantly, why didn't it tell us? Imagine if the world had seen these maps in the 12th century. Imagine if the peoples of Europe had known that oceans connected, that new lands existed, that civilizations had already mastered the art of global movement. Would the Renaissance have come earlier? Would the age of exploration have unfolded differently? Would history itself be a different shape? But the Vatican did not release the maps. It did not announce what it knew. It waited, it watched, and in some cases it likely allowed others to discover what it had long possessed, so long as the narrative remained under control. That is the ultimate power, not to keep knowledge, but to control when it becomes known. Because timing shapes perception. If something is revealed too early, it is heresy. Too late, and it is trivia. But revealed at just the right moment, it becomes doctrine. So what happens when maps surface that don't fit the doctrine? They are labeled forgeries. They are mocked in academic journals. They are quietly buried in obscure collections, or they are retrieved. Time and again, private collectors and archaeologists have come forward with strange maps, only to have them vanish into the hands of preservation specialists, often linked, directly or indirectly, to the Church. Not destroyed, just removed. Because when you hide a map, you don't just hide places. You hide the truth that people once knew where they were going. And once that knowledge is forgotten, any path can be sold as salvation. So we return to the Vatican's shelves, the stone vaults, the forbidden rooms, where maps lie under dust and locks, never released, never disproven, only delayed. But one truth remains. If you control the past's geography, you control the present's imagination. And without imagination, we are all lost at sea. There are no monuments to them, no holidays in their name, no cathedrals to honor what they tried to bring into the light. Their names are whispered sometimes in reverence, more often in warning. They were not warriors, not kings. Their only weapon was truth, and that in the eyes of power made them the most dangerous of all. They were called heretics. But what if they were simply right too soon? Throughout the medieval and early modern eras, men and women who dared to question the Church's version of reality were not debated. They were punished, and often they were silenced permanently. But here's the paradox. The more violently they were erased, the more clearly we see what the Vatican feared most: unauthorized knowledge. Take Giordano Bruno, the philosopher, scientist, and former Dominican friar. In the late 16th century, he dared to suggest that the universe was infinite, that the stars were other suns with their own worlds, and that the divine spark existed in all things, not just within the walls of the Church. For these ideas, not crimes, not violence, but thoughts. Bruno was condemned by the Inquisition and burned alive in 16. He wasn't executed for being wrong. He was executed for being right at the wrong time. Or take Galileo Galilei, whose telescopes allowed him to see what had long been hidden: moons orbiting Jupiter, imperfections on the sun, and the Earth moving through space. When he published these findings, the Church, clinging to the geocentric model as theological truth, put him on trial, forced him to recant the evidence of his own eyes. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, not for fraud, not for heresy in the classic sense, but because he challenged the official calendar of reality. Even earlier, Roger Bacon, a 13th-century friar, began experimenting with optics, lenses, and what we might now call the scientific method. He proposed that experience, not only faith, should guide understanding. For this he was imprisoned by the Franciscans, forbidden to teach, and nearly forgotten. And then there are the nameless ones: monks who quietly translated forbidden manuscripts, midwives who practiced traditional medicine, astronomers who charted stars in secret, architects who slipped hidden geometry into stone, historians who noticed discrepancies and asked the wrong question at the wrong time. All of them branded heretical. All of them remembered, if at all, only through the footnotes of the Inquisitor's reports. The Vatican did not need to silence everyone. It only needed to silence a few, very publicly. Because in the Middle Ages, information traveled slowly, but fear moved fast. If the brightest minds of the age could be humiliated, tortured, or killed for what they saw or thought, then what chance did the ordinary person have? Over time, the population didn't just stop challenging the narrative. They stopped asking. That is the true power of a heretic trial, not the elimination of one mind, but the intimidation of 1,000 others. And yet the most striking realization is this: many of the very heresies that were punished so severely later became mainstream knowledge. The Earth does revolve around the sun. The universe is vast. Other continents exist. Ancient civilizations were far more advanced than the Vatican once allowed people to believe. But when these truths were rediscovered, centuries after the executions, the burnings, the imprisonments, they were reintroduced under church supervision, as if the Vatican had always known, or worse, had known all along. The delay was not ignorance, it was control. Control of the timeline, of how and when truths emerge, control of which questions are asked and which are punished, of what the public is ready for, and what is deemed too dangerous, too soon. And if you wonder, why would the Vatican suppress scientific discovery? Because every new truth is a potential challenge to theological monopoly. If the stars are not fixed above us, perhaps destiny is not fixed either. If the universe is infinite, perhaps God cannot be contained within one institution. If knowledge can be acquired through observation, perhaps it does not need to be granted by clergy. And in such a world, what becomes of a church that has positioned itself as the only bridge between man and the divine? It becomes one authority among many, no longer a gatekeeper, but a voice in a crowd. And that, more than any telescope or theory, was the true heresy. To question the structure, not just the story. To suggest that truth belongs to all people, not just those in robes behind locked doors. This is why the Vatican's relationship with knowledge has never been one of denial, but of delayed permission. It does not say, "This is false." It says, "Not yet." And that delay, that slow drip of truth, gives it time to adapt, to reframe, to remain the center of the story, even when the story begins to shift. But history remembers, and the burned bodies of the heretics cast long shadows, shadows that fall directly onto the very truths we now call self-evident. So we ask, what truths are being delayed now? Which books remain unread? Which ideas wait behind the vault doors of the Vatican, too bright for their time? Because if the past tells us anything, it's this: truth is not a light that shines when it is discovered. It is a light that shines when it is allowed. And too often, that permission comes too late, after the fire, after the silence, after the names have been erased. In the next chapter, we follow the silent ones. The monks who copied, altered, and stored the world's knowledge, not to share it, but to preserve it under lock and key. Because truth does not die easily. But it can be hidden, especially by those who believe they are protecting the world from its own awakening. They wore no armor, they carried no swords. They marched not in columns, but in silence, hoods drawn, quills in hand. While the kingdoms of Europe crumbled into dust, they remained. The monks, the quiet architects of the forgotten. When we imagine medieval monks, we picture stillness, candlelit chambers, whispered prayers, ink on parchment. We think of devotion, solitude, quiet lives spent copying scripture. But beneath that image lies something far more potent, a network of knowledge acquisition, control, and curation that stretched across the continent, like the nervous system of a sleeping giant. And at its head, directing, filtering, absorbing, stood the Vatican. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the secular world fragmented, libraries burned, cities emptied, schools closed, but the monasteries remained, isolated, untouched, and they became the last places where knowledge could survive. But not all knowledge was allowed to survive. The Church understood this early on. Information was power, and those who preserved knowledge would soon have the ability to reshape the past, not by lying, but by deciding what was worth copying. In the centuries that followed, entire civilizations' worth of ideas, Greek philosophy, Roman science, Babylonian mathematics, early medicine, were funneled into the hands of monastic scribes. And these scribes operated under one rule: copy what is permitted, omit what is dangerous, alter what must conform. There were no printing presses, no internet, no backups. If a monk chose not to copy a book, that book died. If he altered a line, that version became history. And if he buried a manuscript in a vault, behind ecclesiastical Latin and holy doctrine, it might as well have never existed. It was not destruction by fire. It was destruction by filtration. Consider this. In the High Middle Ages, it's estimated that fewer than 1 in 10,000 people could read. Of those who could, nearly all were members of the Church, and among them, only a handful were trained to read Latin, the language into which all surviving ancient texts were being translated. But not just any Latin. The Church didn't preserve classical Latin, it preserved a narrower theological Latin, infused with biblical vocabulary, filtered through doctrine. Complex philosophical works were stripped of nuance, scientific terms were replaced with allegory. Ideas incompatible with Church teachings were either left out or worse, rewritten to support them. In this way, the monks didn't just copy the past, they edited it. And as the centuries rolled on, a terrifying reality emerged. The only version of history Europe had access to was the version that passed through a monastery's hands. Entire schools of thought, atomism, stoicism, hermeticism, were forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because they were deemed dangerous. Dangerous to a worldview where knowledge flowed down from the heavens, not up from human inquiry. Monasteries became more than places of faith. They became data centers, archives, silos, gathering manuscripts from across Europe and beyond. Crusaders returned not only with relics but with scrolls. Pilgrims carried tales and texts, and wherever knowledge flowed, monks followed. But once a manuscript entered Church hands, it rarely left. And so the Vatican, through its sprawling network of monasteries, built the greatest collection of ancient knowledge the world had ever known, while simultaneously ensuring the public saw only fragments. Not all monks agreed, some rebelled quietly. In marginal notes they left warnings. This text is older than they say, copied under protest. Do not destroy. These notes, buried in faded ink on crumbling pages, are the only remaining evidence of a silent war between conscience and command. But these rebels were the minority. Most followed orders, not out of malice but out of faith. They believed they were protecting souls by hiding the parts of knowledge deemed too dangerous. They believed that truth was sacred, but only when dispensed by the Church, in the proper way, at the proper time. And so the knowledge of entire civilizations was placed in vaults, sealed in silence. Today we call it preservation. But preservation without access is just a slower kind of erasure. Imagine what lies on those parchment scrolls, stacked in temperature-controlled vaults under Vatican City. Medical diagrams from the temples of Asclepios, engineering formulas from Roman aqueduct builders, star charts from Persian observatories, philosophical treatises from Egyptian mystery schools. All copied, all catalogued, all kept from view. Because once knowledge is hidden, it cannot empower. And without empowerment, the people remain reliant on those who hold the keys. The Vatican's genius was not in destroying truth. It was in owning the only map that leads to it, and deciding who gets to read it. So the next time you hear the phrase "the Church preserved knowledge during the Dark Ages," ask, what knowledge, which parts, and for whom? Because a truth kept in chains is no different than a lie. In the next chapter, we will leave the monasteries and descend even deeper into the earth itself. There, beneath the stones of Europe, lie ruins, technologies and artifacts that speak of knowledge far beyond their time, evidence that history may not be dark, but deliberately dimmed. And always, watching quietly, the Church remains, not to explain, only to decide what the world is ready to know. There are stories that speak in silence. They don't shout from headlines. They don't appear in textbooks. They live beneath our feet in stone chambers, forgotten tunnels, buried machines. And when archaeologists brush away the centuries of dust, they find not just artifacts but contradictions. Contradictions so profound they should have rewritten history. But they didn't. Because something or someone has kept them from doing so. Across Europe, scattered like breadcrumbs in the soil of time, are fragments of knowledge that do not belong to the so-called Dark Ages. Intricately cut bronze gears, advanced hydraulic systems, optical devices with lenses far ahead of their era, tools forged with alloys that supposedly hadn't been invented yet. These discoveries don't fit the official story. So instead of rewriting the story, historians place a label on them: anomalies. Anomalies are convenient. They allow you to file away evidence that doesn't conform, like misplaced puzzle pieces. Except in this case, the puzzle is our entire understanding of human development. Consider the site in southern Germany where archaeologists unearthed a bronze mechanism with toothed cogs dating to the 8th century. It bore an uncanny resemblance to the Antikythera mechanism of ancient Greece, but it was supposedly built in an era when Europe had forgotten such mechanical precision. There were no texts to explain it, no diagrams, just a device that should not exist. In France, beneath a disused monastery, a sealed chamber was discovered during foundation renovations. Inside, a subterranean heating system, similar to Roman hypocausts, but smaller, more efficient, clearly post-Roman. And not a single historical reference to who built it or how. In England, in the ruins of a collapsed priory, fragments of astrolabes were found, metal discs with astronomical markings precise enough to rival Islamic instruments of the 10th century. Yet these were dated to the early 700s, when Europe, according to the official record, had no such astronomical knowledge. And in every case, access was restricted. Artifacts were moved for preservation. Reports were delayed. Some researchers, those who questioned too loudly, found themselves cut off from funding, excavation sites or university backing. You begin to see the pattern: discovery, silence, disappearance. Ask yourself why. Why suppress evidence of advanced knowledge? Because it breaks the narrative. If Europe possessed sophisticated mechanical, astronomical, and architectural knowledge during the so-called Dark Ages, then the idea of a 1,000-year intellectual blackout falls apart. And with it the Vatican's long-standing claim that it preserved knowledge during a time of universal darkness. But what if the truth is this? Knowledge wasn't lost. It was interrupted. And when it resurfaced, it was rebranded. Consider the implications. If remnants of high-level technology existed during the Middle Ages, who was using it? Who built it? And why were their contributions erased from the record? The answer points to the very institutions that controlled that record. The Church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It was the primary patron of archaeology, the gatekeeper of manuscripts, and the approving body for nearly every historical excavation on church-owned lands, which included most of Europe. And within this control lies a quiet power, the ability to decide which discoveries are shown to the public and which are not. In 2006, an independent excavation near a medieval abbey in northern Italy revealed a complex series of underground aqueducts. The water flow system included valves and counterweights not seen again in European design until the 17th century. The site was sealed. The lead archaeologist received a cease and desist letter. The local diocese cited concerns of heritage protection. No public report was ever released. Another whisper beneath the stones. We are told that Europe slumbered after the fall of Rome, that the light of innovation died. But in pockets of Europe, often near monasteries or beneath them, fragments of advanced design appear. Geometric floor plans with golden ratios, columns cut with lathe-like precision, vaulted ceilings designed to reflect sound, not for worship but for acoustic study. These were not accidents. They were echoes. Echoes of a knowledge chain that never truly broke, only went underground. The Vatican's silence in the face of these discoveries is telling. Not denial, not rebuttal, just silence. But silence, when it stretches for centuries, becomes a wall that separates the past we're told happened from the one that actually did. Behind that wall lie the architects we never learned about, the inventors whose names were erased, the scholars who asked the wrong questions. And scattered among them are the artifacts that survived barely, rusted, shattered, but still speaking, still waiting. The Church has never needed to destroy these things. They've only needed to manage their narrative, label the evidence as unusual, delay reports, bury excavations beneath layers of ecclesiastical approval, and remove context. Without context, a gear is just a gear. A map is just parchment. A chamber is just old stone. But with context, they become a threat, because they reveal a different Europe. A Europe where knowledge was not lost but quarantined. Where breakthroughs happened not in the light of history, but in the shadows beneath it. And where the most powerful institution in the Western world, the Vatican, chose not to share the truth, but to shelter it. Perhaps not out of malice, perhaps out of fear. Fear of chaos, of disbelief, of losing the monopoly on knowledge, truth, and time. But if the price of stability is silence, what has been silenced? In the next chapter, we'll meet those who refuse to remain silent. The secret societies, the architects, the initiates, those who built cathedrals with hidden symbols, past truths encoded in geometry, and preserved the flame while the world was told to live in the dark. Because where power conceals, resistance carves its truth in stone. Not everyone bowed. Not everyone believed the world had gone dark. While the Church proclaimed itself the sole custodian of truth, while the monasteries copied and cleansed history, some chose another path, a quieter one, beneath the surface. They were architects, masons, alchemists, mystics, and they built more than stone. They built a resistance. From the 11th to the 14th centuries, across cathedrals and cities of medieval Europe, symbols began to appear, symbols that had no place in official Christianity. Eyes within triangles, suns and moons facing one another, spirals carved into stone, hidden geometries encoded into sacred spaces. The Vatican saw cathedrals as monuments of worship, but to others these were temples of knowledge, hiding truths that could not be spoken aloud. The Freemasons were not originally a secret society, they were master builders, literal stonemasons who inherited sacred geometry from earlier civilizations. But their knowledge extended beyond architecture. It encompassed astronomy, mathematics, symbolism, and most dangerously, a memory of truths older than the Church itself. And so they built Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, cathedrals that defied the technological limitations of their age, rising with mathematical precision the Vatican could not explain, but could not oppose, because they were ostensibly built in honor of God. But the real blueprints told a different story. Embedded in their structures were messages. The golden ratio, encoding the harmony of creation. Labyrinths, symbolizing the path to truth through inner initiation. The twin pillars, drawn from ancient wisdom schools, representing balance of opposites. The rose window, with its perfect fractals, hinting at a universe governed by sacred math, not divine decree. To the uninitiated, these were ornaments. To the initiated, they were warnings. Because knowledge not accepted by the Church had to be passed in code. And so the Masons became secretive, not to conspire against society, but to survive in it. As the Inquisition spread, as libraries fell under censorship, as heretical thoughts led to fire, the Masons and their spiritual cousins went underground. Enter the Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood, said to have emerged from a hidden lineage of Egyptian and Gnostic thought. They claimed to possess texts describing cosmic laws, cycles of destruction and rebirth, and the idea that spiritual truth transcended religion. The Vatican called them occultists, but in reality they were archivists of a different kind of memory, one that didn't rely on Rome. They encoded their teachings in art, in architecture, in layered allegory. A painting of an angel might also depict the movement of Venus. A cathedral's layout might mirror the stars. A stained glass window might reveal the formula for a forgotten element. Nothing was said aloud, but everything was told. And behind them were the alchemists, those medieval figures history paints as madmen trying to turn lead into gold. But the gold they sought was not metal, it was illumination, the transformation of the soul through knowledge. They studied medicine, chemistry, cosmology. They charted the heavens. They explored the mysteries of the human body. Their laboratories were libraries in disguise. Many were monks themselves. Others operated in secret, their scrolls disguised as prayer books, their diagrams hidden behind layers of metaphor. The Church watched them closely, tolerated their experiments so long as they did not question doctrine. But those who went too far, who dared to name what they had seen, were silenced. And so the societies became more secret. Hierarchies emerged. Codes, rituals, symbols that to outsiders looked like superstition. But in truth, they were the last living memory of a world before the monopoly of belief. This was not a rebellion of swords. It was a silent war of memory. The Vatican controlled history through suppression. These secret societies preserved it through encryption. And always, the two forces danced, suppression and survival, authority and symbol, fire and whisper. Historians today often reduce these groups to curiosities, Freemasons as a fraternal club, Rosicrucians as spiritual hobbyists, alchemists as pseudoscientists. But what if that is part of the design? What better way to erase resistance than to trivialize it? What better way to keep the Church unchallenged than to label those who remembered eccentrics, fantasists, conspiracists? But the cathedrals remain. The carvings remain. The encoded texts remain. And in them, we see a different timeline, a hidden thread stretching from the temples of ancient Egypt, through Greek mystery schools, into the silent cloisters of medieval Europe, and then into the minds of those who dared to protect forbidden truths in plain sight. It is said that when the Vatican burned books, the secret societies carved them into stone, because stone endures what parchment cannot. And today, beneath layers of tourist fascination and architectural admiration, the message is still there, waiting. Not all light comes from above. Not all authority wears white robes. And not all truth is chained in the dark. Some of it is hiding in plain view, etched into the walls of places you thought you understood. In the next chapter we turn to modern times, because while the secret societies carved symbols and the Vatican kept vaults, another force began to shape the narrative of the past: media. And through screens and pages, a new illusion emerged, the myth of the Dark Middle Ages. A myth so well crafted, so often repeated, that the truth no longer needed to be buried. It only needed to be forgotten. History can be buried in silence, but it can also be buried under noise. Loud, colorful emotional noise projected onto screens, printed in textbooks and piped into classrooms. In the modern age, truth isn't suppressed by erasing it, It's suppressed by replacing it with something more entertaining, something more palatable, something that feels like truth. Enter cinema. When people imagine the Middle Ages, what do they see? A muddy village, a broken castle, superstition in every eye, peasants toiling in ignorance, priests towering in power, violence, illness, the plague, the rack, a dark church, its bells echoing over silence, and above it all, the Vatican, a mysterious but omnipresent force, vaguely holy, vaguely sinister, always untouched. It is a picture we've all seen. But not in archives, not in primary sources. We've seen it in movies, from The Name of the Rose to Kingdom of Heaven, from Braveheart to the Da Vinci Code. The same images are repeated, reshuffled and recycled, over and over. 1,000 versions of the same tale. The Dark Ages were dark because humanity was asleep, and only the Church had the light. But what if that image was crafted, not inherited? What if the modern myth of the Dark Ages is not just a simplification, but a strategic distortion, shaped as much by Hollywood and national curriculum committees as by any historical fact? In truth, the Middle Ages were complex, dynamic, and far from universally ignorant. There were mathematical treatises, scientific instruments, medical manuals, and philosophical debates. There were translators, astronomers, architects, and artists working within the very monasteries the films paint as caverns of fear. But complexity doesn't make for easy storytelling. And so, in the 19th and 20th centuries, as mass media emerged, history was packaged. Simple narratives replaced layered truths. Filmmakers, often unknowingly, became historians. And the Vatican, once the editor of manuscripts, became the uncredited co-writer of the cultural script. Because the Church did not need to control the cameras. It had already curated the source material. The Dark Ages label itself wasn't even widely used during the Middle Ages. It was retroactively applied by Enlightenment scholars, seeking to define themselves as the return of reason. They painted the previous era as one of intellectual night to make their own age shine brighter. The Vatican didn't contest this story. Why would it? It allowed the Church to remain the central flame in a world of shadow, to position itself as both guardian and redeemer of a benighted past, a guiding light rising out of the wreckage. And film made that narrative immortal. Images bypass critical thought. A single scene of monks burning books is more powerful than 1,000 footnotes. A brooding priest in candlelight, a cross casting long shadows. These are emotional truths, and emotional truths are rarely questioned. Over time, the repetition becomes belief. We believe medieval Europe was primitive because we've seen it. We've felt it in the gloom of film sets, the somber music, the gray skies rendered in post-production. But few notice what's missing from those images. Where are the Arab scholars translating Greek texts while Europe slept? Where are the Chinese innovations? Printing, compasses, medicine, spreading east to west. Where are the hidden libraries, the sacred geometries, the cathedrals built with star-mapping precision? Where are the monks who knew more than they were allowed to write? Gone. Not because they didn't exist, but because their stories were not cinematic, not controllable, not easy to place under a single lens. And so the Vatican allowed the myth to live, even when that myth painted it as authoritarian. Why? Because it kept the Church central, necessary, a beacon of continuity. In a world of superstition and chaos, only one institution remained stable, one source of light, of knowledge, of timekeeping. A useful villain, an even more useful hero. And in this dual role, the Vatican could avoid scrutiny. The secret archives, mysterious yes, but only as plot devices. The lost Gospels, intriguing but fictionalized. The manipulation of time, too far-fetched for the credits. Ironically, cinema became the most effective guardian of the Vatican's historical control. Not because it honored it, but because it never questioned its foundations. Because the greatest trick isn't hiding the truth. It's making the lie feel inevitable. Now consider this. When children learn history, they do not start with primary documents. They start with textbooks, often state-approved, but when they imagine history, when they feel it, they imagine what they've seen in media. And in that convergence, the past becomes curated theater, a performance. And the Vatican? Still directing from the shadows, not with cameras, but with centuries of editorial control over what stories were preserved, what artifacts were displayed, and what gaps were left for others to fill in with fantasy. Today the world sees the Middle Ages not as a bridge between ancient and modern knowledge, but as a void, a black hole in the timeline, a stretch of darkness before the light returned. But darkness doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means the light was deliberately redirected. In the next chapter, we examine what happens when one institution not only shapes the past but controls the timeline itself. Because while the Church filtered books and maps, it did something even more powerful. It became the world's official timekeeper. And in doing so, it ensured that every step forward started with their permission. There are powers more subtle than armies, more enduring than empires. Among them, none is greater than the power to define when something happened. Because if you can control time, you control truth. Throughout history, many have claimed dominion over space, lands, borders, people. But only one institution has claimed dominion over the very structure of time itself: the Vatican. It began, as so much does, with good intentions, or so the records say. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar to correct what was called a drift in the Julian calendar. The equinox was slipping, throwing off the calculation of Easter. And so, with the stroke of a papal pen, 10 days were erased from history. Thursday, October 4th, was followed not by the 5th, but by the 15th. To most, this was just a technical fix, but it was more than a calendar reform. It was a signal. The Church was saying, we decide what day it is, we decide what year it is, we are the guardians of time. And they still are. Because what followed wasn't just a shift in dating. It was a consolidation of power so quiet, so unquestioned, that few ever noticed it. The Vatican's influence over time took three forms: chronology, authority, and memory. The Church didn't just measure time, it restructured it. With the Gregorian calendar, it placed itself at the center of the historical timeline. Events were dated before or after Christ, a framework that remains in place even in secular societies. This was more than theological branding, it was a temporal monopoly. All of human history, ancient, modern, future, was placed on a scale defined by the Church. Even scientific events, archaeological layers, and historical records were forced to conform to a structure the Vatican had shaped. When you place a pin on a timeline, you trust that the rulers and intervals are correct. But what if they're not? What if the entire timeline was stretched, compressed, or edited to favor a narrative? Not just to insert prophecy-fulfilling events, but to legitimize power, to create the illusion of continuity, to link the present Church directly to the apostles in a sacred, unbroken chain. And what if certain centuries were added, as the phantom time hypothesis suggests, to move a pope's reign into alignment with millennial expectations? If you control the calendar, you don't need to falsify events. You only need to rearrange them. In medieval Europe, timekeeping was not scientific, it was ecclesiastical. The Church dictated when hours began, when the year started, when feasts occurred, when fasts began. The concept of standard time didn't exist. Towns rang bells on schedules defined by monasteries. To know the hour was to depend on the Church. Even the 7-day week, absent from many ancient cultures, became universal through Christian doctrine. Sunday became the holy day. Lent defined seasons. The Church calendar was a living structure, governing not just belief, but daily existence. And so, for centuries, time itself was a priestly function. The bell tower was the clock, the liturgical calendar was the planner. Your very sense of when you were was filtered through religious authority. Now ask, what happens to memory when it's tied to belief? The Vatican didn't just shape the flow of time, it shaped what we remember about it. It claimed to preserve history, but in truth, it curated it. And in that curation, a remarkable power emerged, the ability to determine not only what happened, but what mattered. Events that threatened doctrine were downplayed or removed. Entire civilizations were compressed into footnotes. Alternate timelines, lost gospels, inconvenient discoveries, all sealed behind the walls of the archive. And when memory is controlled, time becomes a loop, not a line. People believe they're moving forward, but in truth, they're circling within the same narrative, one maintained by a structure that defines the past, guides the present, and signals the future. In this way, the Vatican became the last guardian of time, not in a mythic sense, but in a logistical, institutional, psychological sense. The keeper of calendars, the editor of timelines, the steward of memory. And it did this not with violence, but with permission. It gave the world a structure, a rhythm, a center, and in return, the world stopped asking how the structure was built. Even today, modern nations follow a calendar born from the Vatican. Businesses schedule meetings by its rules. Governments date documents by its structure. Scientists timestamp discoveries in its format. The Church no longer needs to enforce anything. Its edits are now custom, its timeline invisible law. And here is the deepest irony of all. While the Vatican holds the past in its vaults, it also owns the framework through which the future will be remembered. Because if today's events are recorded using their chronology, then tomorrow's history is already embedded in their structure. And so the question is not just, what have they hidden? It is, what are they still defining right now, without us even realizing it? In the final chapter, we step back. We look not just at the documents and timelines and cathedrals, but at the idea of control itself. What happens when one institution shapes belief, knowledge, and time? And what must happen if the world ever hopes to reclaim the truth? Because history is not just what was. It is what we are allowed to remember. There comes a point when silence stops being absence and becomes strategy. When a question is ignored long enough, when records vanish without explanation, when anomalies pile up in quiet corners of history, the world begins to feel incomplete. Like a manuscript with entire chapters missing, a puzzle with blank pieces that someone has painted over to blend in. At the center of that puzzle sits one institution, unmoved, untouched, timeless. The Vatican. It has outlived empires, outlasted monarchies, withstood revolutions, and through it all, it has held something far more enduring than land or wealth. It has held the story of humanity, of sin and salvation, of time and truth, of darkness and light, and most importantly, of who decides which is which. But as we reach the end of this journey through forbidden books, sealed vaults, vanished years, lost maps, buried machines, and encoded cathedrals, one truth rises above the rest. The greatest secret is not what the Vatican hides, it is why it hides it. And that brings us to the question they fear most. Not what are you hiding? That's too easy. Not who gave you this power. That can be deflected with tradition. Not even what would happen if the truth came out. Because the Church has survived truth before. No, the question they fear most is far simpler, far more dangerous, because it opens the door that cannot be closed again. It is this: what if we never needed you to begin with? What if the knowledge hidden in vaults, burned at stakes, rewritten in Latin, and delayed for centuries, had been free to flow from the beginning? What if Galileo had not been silenced? What if Bruno had lived? What if the ancient books of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy had been preserved for all, not just the anointed few? What if humanity had been allowed to remember what it already knew? Because if we did not need a gatekeeper, then the gate itself becomes the prison. And everything we believed about the light becomes just another filter, dimming what was already there. The Vatican has never claimed to be the source of truth. It claims to be the guardian. But a guardian who never opens the door is not protecting. It is hoarding. And if truth must be protected from the people, then it was never truth. It was a tool used to reshape timelines, sanctify power, erase opposition, and manufacture a version of history where awakening can only happen on command. But here's the paradox. They no longer burn books. They no longer chain scientists. They no longer silence heretics in public squares. They don't have to. Because now we do it to ourselves. We assume the Vatican's timeline is accurate. We accept their maps. We recite their calendar. We absorb their history through films, textbooks, museums, and church tours, never wondering how much of it was curated, how much edited, how much sealed away in archives we're not permitted to enter. That is the final legacy of their control. A world that no longer needs censorship, only consent. And consent is easiest to win when you give people a narrative that feels complete, a story that makes sense, one in which the Vatican stands not just at the center of faith, but at the crossroads of time. But now perhaps that story is beginning to crack. More are asking questions. Why are so many Gospels missing? Why do some maps show the impossible? Why do timelines contradict the sky? Why are the most controversial books not lost but sealed? Why are excavations halted, reports buried, discoveries dismissed? And if everything is as the Church claims, why must so much remain hidden? Because once truth becomes private property, it stops being truth. It becomes policy, and we are all living inside it. But the question they fear, that quiet, dangerous, awakening question, it cannot be buried forever. Because once a person begins to ask what has been withheld, they soon ask why. And once they ask why, they ask the final question. What would the world look like if we remembered everything? Not the filtered past. Not the authorized history. But all of it. The knowledge stored in stone. The maps locked in vaults. The lost years of time. The stories buried beneath cathedrals and sealed behind ecclesiastical Latin. The truths that don't destroy faith, but free it. This story has never been about one institution. It's about every person who was told to stop asking, every idea labeled too soon, every discovery erased, not because it was wrong, but because it was uncontrolled. And so we close not with answers, but with a doorway. Because if even a fraction of this is true, then history itself must be rewritten. Not by popes, not by kings, not by professors in robes, but by all of us together. Because truth is not sacred unless it is shared, and memory is not real unless it is ours. So ask the question, then ask it again. Then open the door.